SpaceX has launched payloads for customers, I think, on every continent right now, except for the southernmost one. Maybe when penguins get a little bit more money, we'll hear about that. NASA has been both greatly benefited by the commercial space industry and also been a critical benefactor for it. In so much of the progress and the groundwork for this industry, like I said earlier, comes from NASA. If they get a 25% budget cut, that is game over for a huge number of things in space.
The idea of exploring outer space, reaching for the stars, has helped drive our imagination and technology since at least the mid-20th century, and it's always been a dream that has inspired me and countless other people. But while space exploration has traditionally been the domain of national agencies such as NASA, current space exploration and technological development has become a major growth outside of just the government. So in this episode, we're going to come to better understand just why the private sector of space tech is so important to our scientific development and our species, what innovations are happening in this field, and how it is redefining the value that space exploration provides to the world. So today, I am joined by Alexander Taleb. Alexander, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So let's talk about outer space. You design spacecraft for a living at a company called Lasath International. What does your job consist of?
So at Lasath International, I'm the Chief Technology Officer, the CTO. So I'm responsible for a large number of things when it comes to the rocket itself, the technology that goes into it, and how we kind of fit into the whole industry in figuring out what a rocket needs to be. So we have a mandate, a mission, and largely what I do is plot the steps to achieve that mission. What criteria do we need to meet on the road to success? And a lot of that comes in the form of designing what the rocket needs to be, not going in and figuring out what like nut and bolt will go into a particular sub part, but figuring out, okay, how do we hit the targets? How do we get as much much bang for our buck? How do we do it in a way that's less wasteful? How do we design in such a way that's appealing to the largest number of customers and things like that. So a lot of it is figuring out like the overall configuration of the launch vehicle, figuring out like, okay, how many stages are we going to have? What kind of engines are we going to have? What kind of propellants or fuels are we going to use on board? What kind of oxygen source are we going to use on board? And working with the engineering team that we have right now. We're a very small company. We're very much in our early days. Our engineering team is very small, but working with the engineers who are experts in a particular area or field, and having a back and forth conversation. So I'll say, hey, we want to have an engine that's kind of like this. I need you to design the first test version of that engine, for example, and that's what we're working on right now as our first campaign towards our first test engine that we're going to be putting on a test stand before not too long.
Cool. So, and I want to get into sort of, the types of spacecraft your company designs and what sort of jobs they actually accomplish in the context of this idea of the private sector versus the public sector of what we'll call space technology. And I know there are a couple of terms that we want to cover first.
Yeah.
This idea of private, sort of commercial space flight, old space, new space. There are some terms that if you want to lay out those terms for us and kind of how should we think about this landscape?
Yeah, so to kind of go into a couple of terms, the two terms that are pretty much universally agreed upon within the industry are old space and new space. So old space are projects that are led up by NASA or the DoD, the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, which are spy satellites, government agencies, and that doesn't just mean the U.S. You have Russia as well, who have had a very long presence in space, longer than any other country, actually. But the European Space Agency, ESA, and Arianespace, the company that builds their hardware and their rockets and their subcontractors. But old space isn't just NASA; it's the companies that build and have built these platforms that NASA and the U.S. government and the other agencies have used. So those are companies that are going to be very familiar to a lot of people, like Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and Lockheed. A lot of people may or may not realize this, but NASA's never really built a rocket themselves. They have led the design and the
Really?
building of it.
So they've never built, or NASA's never built a rocket. Interesting.
Yeah, so it's
Oh,
actually the space shuttle was built by Rockwell. The Saturn V, the different stages were built. Some of them were built by Boeing. Northrop Grumman had pieces of it as well. MIT designed the computers. You had North American Aerospace with designing components as well. You had Rocketdyne and Aerojet working on the engines. So almost every part was made by an outside company at some point, going all the way back to when NASA was founded in the 1950s. But it's always been NASA has been what's called an owner-operator. So they own the rocket. Someone else builds it for them, but they own it. They're the ones who operate it or hire the companies to operate it, contractors and subcontractors and things of the sort. And that's still the model that they're largely using today for flagship missions. And right now, that flagship mission is the Artemis program, an SLS going back to the moon. Now, they have expanded in and brought in other companies into that project, such as Blue Origin and SpaceX. Dianetics are working on it as well. Almost every company that works in aerospace in the country has some kind of hand in the overall program, but it's still being done under the auspices and under, the paradigm of that old way. New space is are newer, more upstart like companies and things that are doing people who are doing things themselves. So you have companies like SpaceX and Rocket Lab; those are new space. They're kind of what I would consider to be the second wave of new space. The first wave of new space was companies like Beale and X-Core and Armadillo and Maston. And if those names are unfamiliar
I've
to
literally never heard of any of those names before. Yeah.
you had to have really been around in the mid 90s or early 2000s, because unless I'm for making a mistake, all those companies are gone. They're all out of business. They've all either closed up shop, been bought up by someone else. They're just out of the industry. They don't exist anymore. There's not even a website for them. But from the ashes of the failures of those first companies, some lessons were learned, and that's how SpaceX came about. SpaceX came about by some people were putting their heads together, some with pretty famous names, some without. And they started a new company that wanted to design the first privately funded launch vehicle in the country. And they were able to buy up some assets from some of those defunct companies for very cheap. SpaceX's test facility, for example, right outside of Waco in McGregor, Texas, that was actually a legacy piece of land that was developed as a rocket test site that they got for super cheap because the company didn't exist anymore. But yeah, so those, and then you have what I would call like a third wave of new space, and that's companies like Relativity is a big name. There were a few others like ABL who have since changed their name and they've left the commercial area and are focusing on government and stuff now. You had Virgin Orbit, who are not around anymore. You had Astra, who are in a strange in between place. And then for new space, you have kind of the outlier, which is Blue Origin, who have been around for forever. They're older than SpaceX, but only in the past 12 months reached orbit for the first time. They move very slowly on purpose, or they had been moving very slowly, very gradually, step by step. Their logo was the tortoise from the story of the tortoise and the hare, small steps win the race. Doing suborbital launches with their rocket, New Shepard. And that one has made headlines multiple times because of various celebrities on board going on very short suborbital flights. But that's only about when it comes to about like the size and the power and the capability, that's only about 10% of what you need to get even the smallest amount of to orbit. So they're not really comparable. Virgin Galactic has also been around for a while. They've never had orbital aspirations that have been tangible. They're kind of in a strange interregnum where they have wound down one program that was at best partially successful, and they're moving on to something different. What that is exactly, only the people who have worked there who have signed NDAs could know. So I don't know that, but that's the new space realm. It's startups. It's it's companies that don't behave like your like Boeing that's been around since the 1920s, like 100-year-old company, or your big defense contractor. They're there to service whoever has the money to buy their service, their product, whether it's a government, whether it's a private individual, companies, universities, other governments outside the U.S. And that's really the differentiation between the two. Now, there's the term private spaceflight, and that really means spaceflight that is done by anyone other than, a government agency, whether it's NASA or Roscosmos in Russia or the European Space Agency. But I'm not the biggest fan of that term, including companies like SpaceX or Rocket Lab, because I've seen that I think there's a difference between commercial space and private space flight. For me, the idea is commercial space flight is something that is a company working independently, responding to what people need who are in the space industry, because rockets are a very, very small part. They're the loudest part. They're the most impressive when they work and when they don't work, but really it's the satellites in space that are the absolute biggest part. Every satellite up there is doing a job. It is there to function. It's doing something, whether it's a weather satellite or an observation satellite, or if it's a communication one. And if it's not doing that job, it's useless, and no one's going to keep it up there. They're just going to let the thing go derelict, or they're going to deorbit it and let it burn up so that it doesn't turn into space junk. So commercial space is the way that I have always envisioned the separation. Is commercial space is say SpaceX launching another DirecTV satellite up there. Anyone who wants to watch all the cable channels but maybe lives in a remote area, they're going to go with DirecTV. You are a customer of two different space companies by default: DirecTV, all that satellites, and whoever launched that satellite for them on top of their rocket. Private spaceflight is the term that everyone kind of uses, but in my mind, I've always felt that private spaceflight has a certain connotation of a vanity aspect to it. So, like Virgin Galactic, which whose sole purpose has been providing suborbital rides for paying passengers. Blue Origin's New Shepard platform, some of those flights are for carrying essentially passengers, just, tourists, the same way that a tourist might take a helicopter flight around New York City up into the lower edge of space for just a few minutes. Or maybe someone who's ultra wealthy buying a flight to the International Space Station, either through Russia or through one of the several companies out there now that actually work with NASA to get payloads up to the space station, whether they're human payloads or scientific ones. And usually they're a little bit of both. But the terms can be somewhat interchangeable depending on who you're talking to. That's just my personal demarcation between commercial space and private space flight. Private space flight is kind of like, individuals wanting to do something, and then commercial space is rockets, satellites, and things like that out there to do a job outside of just, your government operations. If it's just, another $2 billion spy satellite, or, another replacement for an ISS module, things of the sort.
Okay. So that makes a lot of sense. And I have a good sense now of like private versus commercial, and then old space, new space. So, and we're going to focus on mostly on sort of the commercial new space kind of side in this discussion. And what I'm curious to hear more about, you touched on it a little bit already, is sort of what services these private spaceflight companies perform? Like, what do they actually do? What problems do they solve? What opportunities are they offering to people? Why should we care? Why are they actually useful? And I'm only saying this because, general assessment here, but there can sometimes be sort of a popular conception of, oh, it's these vanity projects for these billionaires, and like, why should we care? But it's actually very important. And, so
Yes.
why is that?
Yeah, so it's absolutely critical. Commercial space, private space, whatever you want to call it, is absolutely essential to global infrastructure, whether you know it or you like it or not. And that's not to say that wealthy vanity projects don't exist within the industry. They absolutely do. And they're probably not going to go away anytime soon, but they're a very, very, very small part of the equation. A rounding error minuscule if I had to take a guess. But for example, the example I just gave a second ago was DirecTV. That's something that everyone can relate to. Every single station, every single spot in the sky where you can get dish television, that is coming from a satellite. That is one of the more popular use cases. GPS is a government run program, but some of those satellites are now going up on commercial, like new space rockets, like SpaceX rockets, out there for much cheaper than they were able to be launched beforehand. GPS. I mean, I don't have to tell you or any of your listeners how useful and how critical GPS has become in everyday life. Satellite radio, is another big one, but the one that is really, really expanding. And there are lots of other ones that I haven't gone into yet, but the biggest one, the most visible one, is becoming internet service providers in space. Starlink went from absolutely nothing like 5 years ago. No one had ever heard of it to everyone has heard of Starlink now. A huge number of people have that service, and for a huge number of their customers, it is the very first time they have had access to broadband internet where they live or where they work. And Starlink is not the only internet constellation out there. You also have Amazon Kuiper, which is in development. You have OneWeb, and those are only the ones based in the US. They're going to be ones based out of probably the EU very soon. China is almost certainly working on one. Russia is probably publicly saying they're working on one, which means they're probably not. But yeah, we're going to get to a point where a lot of our infrastructure for just streaming things like that, getting the news, making even phone calls over the internet, depending on what kind of latency you can put up with, that is all going to be happening through space. Some of the other applications is weather monitoring, climate monitoring. You can even use it for traffic, agriculture. Almost every industry that you can think of has something that they can measure or look at from orbit and probably already do. And that's not to mention the scientific applications as well, in terms of, observing, the outer planets, stars, solar science, all that stuff.
Now, in terms of your company and sort of the service that your company provides, Lasath, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are called we're called what the industry refers to as a launch service provider. And for the most part, a lot of the other names in the space industry that people have heard of, like SpaceX or Blue Origin, their primary mission either was or currently is being a launch service provider. And so what that means is that there is someone out there who has something they want to launch into space, some kind of satellite, some kind of payload, but they don't have the means to get that payload into space themselves. So what they do is they come up to us, they hire us, they say, we need to go to this orbit within this period of time. And this is how much our satellite weighs, and what other ride conditions they have. And we say, yes, we can do that. This is our price. And they say, okay, here's the down payment. Launch it. We launch it. They give us the rest of the money, and we're done. And provided the satellite gets to where it needs to be when it needs to be, we get paid, and our work there is done. The same way. You get picked up by a taxi driver on your way to the airport or something. They're just there to take you from point A to point B. Really not much else outside of that. Now, SpaceX, of course, has their Starlink program. Blue Origin has other programs going on. like lunar lander technology and things like that. But in terms of the rocket side of things, that's what we're doing. That's what Rocket Lab has been for a while. That's what Relativity had baselined for a while as well. So that means that we're open to pretty much anyone that we're legally allowed to work with who has the money. You know, so provided you're not sanctioned by the U.S. government, we can take customers from overseas, and we're very eager to do so. We have international in the name. SpaceX has launched payloads for customers, I think, on every continent right now at this point, except for the one at the southernmost one. There's governments, other governments as well. Canada doesn't have their own rocket, so they go to the European Space Agency, or they go to American companies if they want to launch a satellite. Very few countries currently right now have their own capability to launch their own rockets or satellites to orbit, so they have to go to one of the players who can. So that's the U.S., the Europeans, China, Russia. India is
India
part of
and
that now.
Japan would be the other
Japan.
two.
Yep.
Yeah.
Japan has some very good rockets. India has a very active space program that's not just doing commercial stuff, but doing some bold scientific work as well. China, of course, as well doing that. One thing that I do need to point out is that a lot of those other countries, though, that do have the ability to put commercial stuff into space, there's not a big market for them anymore because they have those costs and that legacy and that bureaucracy that U.S. government launches had as well, and SpaceX and other commercial operators have eaten up a huge amount of their customer base to the point where if you're a government launch operator, you kind of are building rockets mostly for yourself and for your own use. And the US government does that. They have rockets that they have commissioned to be built by other companies like United Launch Alliance. That is there specifically for government use. They don't have to deal with other customers, eating up all of the rockets and the supply running low. They kind of have their own, platform that they can call on when they need to.
I didn't actually ever think about that. I mean, but it totally makes sense. I was just imagining, for whatever reason, like, oh, it's American customers in the U.S. that you're working with. But it's like, no, they're not only people in other countries, but they're the governments of plenty of other countries. And, I'm thinking about, like, I don't know, Mexico, or, Argentina, or, Thailand, or wherever. And it's like, these are countries and they need to get stuff up into space, but like they don't have the launch capabilities for it. So you got to go to other people. And actually, to that point, this idea of the interaction between these government agencies and then sort of the commercial world, obviously there are terms and agreements that exist between private sector and public sector, but do you want to talk a little bit more about that interaction? And
Yeah.
maybe we can focus on NASA or you want to go international, either way.
Yeah, so I'll go with NASA because I know a lot more about that,
Sure.
and so do your listeners. And NASA is really the agency that has done the most in space, to be entirely honest. But NASA has been both greatly benefited by the commercial space industry and also been a critical benefactor for it. And when I say benefactor, I don't mean that they're handing out money for free for nothing, but they have had programs in the past that have been incredibly successful, and they have ones currently that are currently very successful, where they are helping small companies get started by giving them small grants or contracts. And these grants or contracts have conditions where, you get your first down payment to get started. But if you don't give NASA what they have asked for, what they bought from you, or what they've hired you to do, you're not going to get paid the rest. But I mean, again, SpaceX, being the big name, the flag bearer for the industry, a lot of what got them from, nothing to where they are was cooperation with NASA. And it wasn't just monetary. It wasn't just NASA giving them money over and over and over again until they got it right. A lot of what it was there were some grants where they said, hey, you're developing something that we actually want, or a contract, you're developing this and we want that as well. where NASA, hired them to do a job, and they did. But additionally, because NASA taxpayer dollars, that means that as an American company, a lot of that technology that NASA's developed was made available to them because, it's part of the public, really, when you think about it. And SpaceX used that to their advantage to really speed up the development of some of their technologies because they didn't have to do it from scratch. NASA provided a lot of that information and data. And the thing is that if you wanted to start a space company, or if I wanted to do it again, or if your listeners wanted to, they have that same access that SpaceX did, that Virgin Galactic did, that Rocket Lab did in their early days, even though Rocket Lab's kind of a strange case because it was actually started in New Zealand and it's still largely a New Zealand company, or New Zealandic company, but with a maybe majority presence now in the United States. But yeah, so I mean, it would be like, NASA was essentially a library when you think about it. It's a public service to provide information to people, and NASA provides a lot of information to the American public. You can go and download a huge number of research papers online right now for free without an account or anything. If you're a U.S. company and you have a contract with NASA, you're given a huge number of resources that are absolutely fantastic. Now, what has NASA's benefit been is that NASA has been able to let go of some really, really expensive programs where they were the only people using that hardware, like the Space Shuttle. The Space Shuttle was retired because NASA needed a way to get 4 people to space, to the International Space Station, and bring them back after a couple of months. The space shuttle was not suitable for doing that. It was designed to carry 7 people and then massive, huge, heavy payloads. It was dangerous. It cost uh, astronomical sums, to use a topic appropriate word. So if you're just going up and down, shuttling astronauts, ironically, it wasn't the best spacecraft for that job. So they went out there and they hired 4 or 5 different companies to develop some kind of baseline prototypes and technologies, and some of them flew and some of them did not. Some of the companies went bankrupt and went bust because they couldn't do it and they didn't get paid for the work they didn't deliver on. Some of them did deliver, and they were successful. And NASA whittled it down to what they needed. And that first contract was really successful. And there were two providers who got that, and that was Orbital Sciences, which are now part of Northrop Grumman, and SpaceX. And they were hired to take capsules full of supplies with no people on board to the space station. So, new experiments, food and water, air.
And when is this happening? This is like early 2000s.
So these contracts were going out around, mid 2000s was
Okay.
when they were conceptualized, and 2012 was when it was made real by SpaceX with Dragon. Orbital, I think, was maybe the next year, around 2013 or so. And then they said, okay, well, the space shuttle's retired, but we've got a way to get supplies to the International Space Station. We want to get now we want to get the astronauts up there ourselves without having to rely on a Russian Soyuz anymore. So they did the same process again. Of course, SpaceX got picked, but this time Boeing was picked with Starliner. Now, Starliner has had a very, very troubled development. It launched originally in December of 2019. That flight failed to complete the vast majority of its objectives. They did a successful test flight with no people on board. They did a first test flight with people on board, and that one did not go according to plan. And the capsule had to come back empty, and there was a lot of talk of the astronauts stranded, which they weren't. They were safe. They were fine. They were kept on board the space station because it was just like, okay, well, we've got 3 people here. We might as well, they were trained to be up here for much longer than planned. Let's use them, to do science and stuff. And that was always a consideration. That was always something that they knew could happen, and something that they had planned for did. But yeah, so NASA has been able to let go of something that was costing $2 billion a launch when you included the development cost into it, and they're now doing it for you know, fractions of that price. I think probably like 5 or 10% of that. I'd have to look up the
Yeah.
number
Okay.
again.
But yeah, like a small fraction of what
Yeah,
it used to
a
cost to
small, yes, a
launch a space
small,
shuttle.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so all that money that was being used on the space shuttle for building and then servicing the space station, and the building part was very important, but the servicing of the International Space Station, that money that would have gone into the space shuttle is now going into other things like trying to go back to the moon with the Artemis program. And the International Space Station is going to be following a similar route. It's reaching the end of its life. This is not going to be a premature ending for it. It was designed for a certain number of years, and it's had its life extended several times because it's a great platform. But it's a very expensive one as well, and the technology that was used in the late 80s to early 90s when they were developing it can now be acquired for, again, a fraction of the cost. So NASA, what they're going to do is go to commercial companies and say, so it's like, all right, we want a space station, this is what we want, design and build it and launch it for us, and we're going to pay for our share of how much we use it. Now, is that 100%? Is that 50%? Is that going to be 90%? That's to be seen. But as we've seen with the SpaceX Dragon, for example, that's, 90% of the flights are used and paid for by NASA, and that's a service they pay for that they are getting. But because they're not the owner and operator for it, they don't have to pay the expenses when it's sitting around doing nothing. So SpaceX can sell that service to people or organizations that have the money and bring down the operating costs. And they've done that several times now. They've done 2 or 3 flights that have been funded by outside, wealthy benefactors. But then there have been flights where they have been hired by a commercial company to go up to orbit and take people and scientific experiments up there. And they have taken them to the space station. There was a flight about a month or two ago from a company called Axiom, where none of the passengers on board were tourists going to the space station, but it was still a commercial flight. They were all astronauts from other countries and other space programs, where instead of going through NASA's launch program, NASA said, okay, well, if you want to send your people up there to the space station, we'll let you, do stuff on the space station. You just have to pay, for the usage of it. But you have to get there yourself. So they went through SpaceX and did that. And it was a very successful mission. Even probes going to the outer planets now are being launched on commercial rockets. They're not being done on, your Atlas V or Delta IV, which has since been retired. NASA can just go say, hey, we want to schedule a flight with you guys, whether it's Firefly, Rocket Lab, SpaceX, any other company, mine, for example. They'll say, we want to schedule a flight. We'll pay you, this amount, contract signed, and you do it. And so it's really expanded what they can do, especially on the smaller side of things, because the rockets that NASA has had available to them, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, have been pretty large ones, or at least for the missions that have been really notable. And now they have access to small and medium ones, and of course larger ones as well. But again, all for a fraction of the price that they were paying for them 15, 20 years ago.
Well, first of all, that's good for efficiency. The more efficient this can be, the better it is for everyone. We can drive the cost down, then we can use our resources to do more things. I'm actually, and you were talking about the outer planets, you were talking about sort of satellites that are going into I guess it would be, forgive me if I'm wrong on the term here, like deep space or like further out into the solar system. And obviously correct me on those terms, but and also in this category, I'm curious to hear about just like some of the big headlines that are occurring in sort of the world of commercial space flight as of we are recording this, sort of mid 2025. What are some of the big headlines that people can kind of be aware of?
Yeah, so
Big projects in the works, all that sort of stuff.
when it comes to like the big scientific missions that you see, in the news and stuff like that, most of those are still a NASA project where the payload, the actual probe itself, or the rover, or the satellite, or whatever terminology is applicable, that's something that's designed and built by NASA. Oftentimes, JPL is responsible for that. Sometimes other universities, institutes, sometimes other companies as well, like commercial companies. Where the commercial spaceflight side of things comes in is that some of the parts for those, if they can use off the shelf parts, some of those parts have come down in price. And again, the one of the biggest expenses in the scientific missions is the launch, and one of the riskiest things is the launch. And commercial spaceflight has dropped the cost of that by quite a bit and greatly lowered the risk. Falcon 9 is probably the most reliable, successful rocket ever built. Its success streak is absolutely fantastic. There are other rockets that have been whose success rate have been just as high, if not higher, but they've only flown a limited number of times in comparison. I think SpaceX just reflew a booster for like the 450th, 490th time, something like that. We're getting close to them having reused a rocket 500 times, and that is something that 10 years ago even just did not sound like it was going to ever be a realistic thing. It sounded like like aspirational science fiction. But for the science missions, there's some smaller ones that have really benefited from them. A lot of them are Earth observation ones. Some of them are solar observatories. Some of them are actually lunar ones, where commercial companies are now flying landers to the moon. And if you want to do science on the moon, you can purchase or their services, or you can purchase their design or partner up with them, and NASA has done that already for smaller, cheap lunar landers. Now, the success rate for those is currently pretty low, but there've only been a handful of them, so people are learning, and they're learning very quickly. And like the early days of spaceflight, everyone's seen the old films from the 50s and 60s of all the rockets blowing up. The only way that you can get something to be reliable is to figure out all the problems. And one of the things that the commercial industry does very well is testing on the ground, testing in flight, and working out those failures before they field it in an operational way. A really good counterexample to that was the space shuttle. That was not as thoroughly tested. It had a lot of flaws make it through its entire lifespan, and twice that came to an incredibly tragic head. But yeah, to kind of go back to it. I mean, it's like if NASA wants to do something on the moon and someone's already sending a commercial lander on there and there's space on board for NASA's experiments or payloads, they're going to pay a fraction of the price they would have 10 years ago to do that. It used to be, imagine like, sailing across the ocean, 1,000 years ago, if you wanted to do it, you had to build a ship. You had to do the whole thing yourself, and now you just buy a seat on a plane and you're there in, 8 hours. Being crammed in economy. And that's where we're moving the spaceflight direction. Is not everything has to be custom built. Not everything has to be a one-off. You can do things together, whether it's a partnership or just hitching a ride on a rocket with 15 other customers. I mean, there have been launches that have launched over 100 satellites in a single launch, where you're just buying a seat, like on a plane.
Work me through that. I mean, that just you saying that number of 100 satellites in a single launch, that must be a very large rocket that's doing that, and the satellites, I'm assuming, would be pretty small. But
Yeah, so these are all very
put that
small
in
satellites.
perspective for me, kind of how.
Yeah. Yeah, these are all very small satellites. And again, it was a larger rocket. It was a Falcon 9. But what they do is they had a structure designed on it where satellites could just slot in, provided they used a standard common interface. And they said, hey, we're going to launch this month of this year. If you want to go to this orbit, let us know. And if your satellite can plug into our container to carry satellites, and you can pay us for it, we'll take you up. And that's what my company's doing as well. It's but a little bit more flexible. So, like I said, there were 100 satellites on there. If that rocket wasn't going to where you wanted it to, you're kind of out of luck, you know? So what we're planning on doing is offering that flexibility and that capability and that pricing where things are really cheap, but taking payloads to or taking customers to where they want to go when they want to go. So we're building a rocket that is sized for that. So it's going to be smaller than a Falcon 9, larger than a Rocket Lab Electron, which is a very small rocket. But what we found is that if you 1,500 kilograms to low Earth orbit is a really great spot to be because you can still take clusters and offer those airline flight or those like bus ticket style flights to space. But at the same time, if someone says, "Hey, well, I've got a satellite that's a lot bigger than just your small little slot. Can I just hire you for the whole thing?" We can do that as well, and then we can take them to whichever orbit they want to go to, whether it's orbit at this angle around the planet or that angle, or if they want to go into a polar orbit, or if they want to go to a slightly higher one, or if it needs to be launched on a certain day, and that sort of thing. And that's a side of the industry that's really underserved at the moment. That size, everyone's jumping from a very small rocket to a very large one, and no one's looking in the middle. Or there are people looking in the middle for us, for example, but there's not a provider who can provide that just yet, and a lot of people who want to launch things into space are looking for that. People who want something more capable than just a little CubeSat that runs on an Android that can do a very limited things for a very limited amount of time, but they can't afford like a massive rocket all to themselves. They need something a little bit more like a I've called it like the four-door sedan of
Yeah.
rockets. It gets you to where you need to be. It's got
Yeah.
reasonable capability. It's not too large. It's not too small. It works for you. That sort of deal.
What are actually, I'm curious, what are the different sort of payload volumes or sort of payload categories that we have? We sort of have like, rockets with small payloads, medium payloads, large payloads, sort of what kind of weight are we talking about with
So
some of these?
CubeSats can sometimes be just a couple of kilograms. They can be very small. Now, a CubeSat can be multiple cubes put together, so you could build them up into larger ones. But for example, a really good example of a really good small successful rocket is Rocket Lab's Electron. It's named after the electron in the atom because it's powerful but very small. And they have some great technology in that rocket. I really like what they did with it, but it can only take about 150 to 200 kilograms to low Earth orbit, which is not a lot. They they've figured out some absolutely great things to do with that capability, and really made it punch kind of above its weight in terms of some of the payloads and some of the missions it can fly. But then you have SpaceX at the other end with 10,000 kilograms, depending on the launch. SpaceX has kind of got this interesting thing going on where the rocket can either be thrown away, but most of the time they're reusing it, so they're not using its full power. Not to mention they have the Falcon Heavy configuration. You have New Glenn from Blue Origin, which is even larger than Falcon 9 by quite a bit. You've got Firefly right in the middle at about 1,100 kilograms. That's pretty close to us, but the rockets are expendable. They get thrown away after each flight. They over the past couple of years they've only launched 6 times, and the rocket has completely failed twice, and then only kind of worked 2 of those times. They've only had two successes without any kind of like asterisk or qualification next to it. So there's not a lot going on in that middle area. But for example, like going back to the 200 kilograms, you can put something like a small weather satellite, something into a polar orbit for taking pictures of maybe farmland over your country. At 10,000 kilograms, you're launching, huge payloads, reconnaissance satellites, massive communication ones to geostationary orbit, people to the space station. You can launch space station modules, or you can launch dozens and dozens of small or medium-sized ones, and you'll see both of those. One of the reasons why internet from space has only recently become a thing is because of this whole cluster technology, where the satellites can communicate with each other in low Earth orbit and then with the ground. The reason we haven't seen that before is geostationary communication satellites are very far away, so there's a communication lag, and that lag is just enough to make the internet not really usable in a two-way connection. It's fine for satellite radio or direct TV when you don't realize that it was sent 3 seconds ago, but when you're on the ground using internet, that is a big deal. And so what they've done is they've moved away from these 10,000 kilogram, $2 billion communication satellites that are out 36,000 kilometers away, that are designed to last 20 years. And now they're just building clusters of several hundred small ones that are dirt cheap in comparison. And they're flying all over low Earth orbit in a web, in a mesh. And if one of them breaks, who cares? Their backups everywhere. There's redundancy in the system where if your, satellite that was designed to last 20 years and cost $2 billion or more breaks, you're completely out of luck. So it's kind of that whole, decentralization of your risks that that has really there's been a shift to that in the market over the past 4 or 5 years, and that's really where communications are going to be lying in the future. Is not not in geostationary anymore for the most part, but in low Earth orbit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of the weird analogy of like it would be a fighter jet versus drones in warfare, and kind of they maybe serve different services, but that idea of like we're putting all of our eggs into this one really expensive, highly engineered thing versus this other category of we're just going to have 100 of them, and if we lose a few, that's fine.
Yeah, it's a lot like that. Yeah, or like how battleships gave way to fighter planes off of carriers
Yes,
in World War
yes,
II,
yeah,
or
exactly, yeah.
or even in a in commercial aviation, you see that a lot. The 747 isn't really around that much anymore. The
Yeah, it's really
A380 is kind
not.
of
Yeah.
gone. Is going that way, and it's all single decker twin engine aircraft, and that's because there are all these different efficiencies that were found we're not talking about risk really much here, but if, just efficiency in terms of flexibility and having more medium-sized airplanes going to like every airport on the East Coast, rather than, oh well, we're only flying across the Atlantic from New York to London and you have to get there yourselves. We're seeing stuff like like Manchester to Raleigh, North Carolina, and stuff like that. And that's I specifically use examples like that to describe what my company is going to be doing in spaceflight, and that's the direction it's been going for about 5 to 10 years now, and that's where a lot of people see it going. Is a lot of space companies now are not trying to. A lot of people have learned, oh, if you try to go after SpaceX, you're not going to succeed. They kind of have, a strong grasp on that side of the market. But if you go to the satellite communication side of things, that market's untapped. Now, of course, there's going to be, a bubble that's going to burst on that side of things most likely. And my company we're being really smart, and we're going into a segment of the market where we don't have competitors really in the traditional sense. We have we have companies that hire the same kind of people and perform the same sort of tasks, but for completely different segments of the market. The same way that the sort of people who build like 18 wheelers, and the sort of people who build smart cars, and the sort of people who build sedans and SUVs, those are all, like the same kind of factories, the same kind of people, but they're all doing different things. No one's like, oh, well, you know what, I'm a two-seat car maker, and I really lost a huge market share to Ford pickup trucks. Like, no one's ever said that before.
Do you want to talk about some of the challenges that you're facing in your industry and sort of the resources you require? Money is obviously a very key one. We can always take that as a given. But sort of other problems you run into, other hurdles that you find in not only your company, but in commercial spaceflight more generally, or even just all of spaceflight, all of it.
Yeah, so to start with kind of more maybe political economic ones, without going too much into
Culture war territory, yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
I mean, I think everyone can agree that things are kind of up in the air with this administration, shall we say,
Yes, yes.
to put it gently. Um, NASA had a proposed 25% budget cut. Seems like the House has reversed that, but no one really knows what's going to happen with the NASA budget. The administration pulled their first proposed administrator for political reasons. It was the huge falling out with Trump and Musk, and that has made certain people nervous about the what's going to happen with spaceflight because SpaceX right now kind of has a monopoly in the outside of Russia for sending people to the space station until Boeing gets their act together. Um, in so much of the progress and the groundwork for this industry, like I said earlier, comes from NASA. If they get a 25% budget cut, that is game over for a huge number of things in space. Everything aside from one or two flagship missions are going to feel the pain or just go away completely. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and pretty much in every industry, but in spaceflight as well, there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and people don't want to really throw money around on things that could go haywire, disappear because of whatever the government decides to do or not do. And this this administration is very changeable. Uh, uh, there's not even the consistency to be able to plan. You have to kind of plan for anything that could happen. There's been, I mean, of course, there's always the technical side of things
Of course, yes.
as well, and designing and building a rocket and flying it it's a massive undertaking. It is one that almost no one has ever gotten right on the first try. There have been a few outliers where people have had a successful launch on their first flight, but I mean, a lot of people might not find comfort in this, but most times when a rocket flies for the first time, it blows up. It just does, and that is why uh, you do a lot of testing on the ground to minimize that risk. You do a lot of practice runs, and then when you fly it for the first time, you don't have anything important on board. So you'll have an inert payload, definitely no people on board. Maybe you'll have a satellite on board, but it's with someone who essentially says, "Hey, we've got a satellite, but no money. If you can launch it for like mostly free, we'll put on your rocket knowing it's probably not going to make it past 2 or 3 miles up." And I mean, there's some people who believe that if your rocket doesn't blow up on the first time, you've done something wrong because it means you spent too much time and money making everything absolutely perfect, and you could have actually spent less time and money, and kind of worked out the flaws in that first flight. I'm not one of those people, but an argument could be made for it. But most organizations, whether a government or commercial company, they find their success to orbit on the first, or sorry, on the not on the first, but on the second, sometimes the third flight. And that's where SpaceX's Starship has been strange in that it's flown 10 times and not had a single complete success, and the last 3 or 4 flights have just been complete technological failures. They upgraded and fixed a lot of problems, but somehow discovered new ones and weren't able to fix those. It's but it's just it's a massive undertaking, and it's one of those things that no one person could ever mentally keep track of everything. That's why rockets launching a rocket takes a huge team. Mission control is always dozens of people, and it takes years and it takes lots of money because it's a lot of work to do, and it's very difficult and hard work to do. And I'm not trying to play off anything here. It's work that can be done. It's been done successfully and it'll be done successfully again. But there's just a lot to go through and get right. It's kind of like packing your suitcase for like a month long vacation or something. There's so many things to remember, so many things to get right and lined up and prepared and stuff like that. And the first time you do it, you're invariably going to forget one or two small things. So you try to pack in a way where if you forget something, you have a way to work around it. And rockets are never perfect. Even ones that have flown, 500 times are not perfect. They have things break and fail all the time. And the reason why they don't blow up immediately is because you have to think ahead and think about, like, what could break? What do you want to make redundant? What do you want to make extra strong? Because something is going to go wrong at some point. So you want to have you have to spend a lot of time and money figuring out what can go wrong and how to stop it, or have like a workaround in case it does. Like, oh, the main computer crashed right after takeoff. Well, good thing the backup was already running. Things like that. And there's some cultural hurdles as well. A lot of people think that, space is a vanity project for billionaires, or space is just a prestige thing. Countries launching astronauts in space and not really anything's happening up there that's useful. And there have been some missions that do actually fall into those categories, but the vast majority of them, even if you're sending people into space to the space station, they're up there working, sometimes 7 days a week. They're all up there doing science, mostly for the benefit of us back here on Earth. A lot of it's actually biomedical science. A lot of work in medicine is being done on the ISS because certain conditions for certain biological processes can't be replicated in 1G, but they can be done in microgravity up there. Things about the human body and how it works in different conditions, like with bone loss and things like that. A lot of discoveries have been made that way as well. And I know this is a little bit of a tangent from the initial question, but so much of our modern technology, especially with computers like smartphones and navigation and things like that, have come as first, second, and third order effects of things that were initially developed for spaceflight.
That was literally going to be sort of my next question, which is kind of this countering the naysayers. And it's not a lot of people, but I have heard this argument, even from people I know, which is sort of, we should focus on the planet here, and until we solve everything, why are we worrying about outer space? And I just want to kind of keep hitting a little bit more on what you were just talking about. Like, there are all of these tangible benefits that come from us spending time in outer space and building out, both our technology and also just our understanding of reality, of physical matter. But just like, yeah, like if there are other things you want to add to this about, here's why having viable space programs actually matters and benefits humans.
Yeah, well, it's like I touched on it earlier. Every satellite up there is doing a job, and it can no longer do that job, it's turned off or thrown away. So no one's really, I mean, maybe one or two people, but no one's really just keeping a satellite running up there doing nothing just because they can. They're doing something, and 99 point probably 5% of something like that of satellites that have been launched, payloads have been launched, all of their sensors and antennas are pointing down at Earth. They're looking at what's happening on the planet. They're looking at us. They're looking at the sky, the weather, the climate, all sorts of things. And there are a lot of things out there that can only really reliably be done from orbit. Just look at this hurricane season is going to be starting soon, and a lot of the information that we're going to be getting on the hurricanes that are going to be forming before too long is going to come from space-based assets like the GOES satellites. Soon you'll be able to make a phone call to pretty much anywhere on Earth over the internet from satellites that are in orbit. And even the astronauts on board the International Space Station, they're spending all day conducting experiments on everything from like radiation, biomedical processes, testing out new materials to see how they work in different conditions. Some of what they do is pointed out, like they'll maybe do some astronomy on there, but for the most part, space astronomy and space telescopes are best done outside of low Earth orbit, with the exception of Hubble, really. Like James Webb, for example, is at a Lagrange point, and there are various reasons for that as well. Yeah, very little. A lot of people don't realize this, is that NASA does not get the majority of the money that's spent in space by the government. It's actually DoD, NRO, other organizations get the majority of the money. depending on what program's going on. During Apollo, things were a bit different. With Artemis, maybe there'll be a change in that direction. But I mean, if something's useless, they're just not gonna do it. Now, sometimes these flagship missions, the ones that really make the headlines, might seem to people like they're not, the most applicable, to their everyday lives. Such as Curiosity and Perseverance on Mars. You've got Dragonfly going to Titan before too long. Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, Raven, Juno, and Juice, and the Europa Clipper, and all those missions. But at the end of the day, those are all scientists working on Earth, and all the data they collect comes back here, and you never know what you're going to find. And that's a lot of the exciting part of it, and of course, national prestige is part of it. Wanting to attract the best and the brightest around the world, because a lot of these scientists who work on these aren't from the U.S. I mean, our first rockets were essentially German designs, designed by Germans out in New Mexico and Alabama after the war. But a lot of really great scientists come from all over the world to work for NASA, to work for JPL, to study things in space and other planets, around other solar systems even now. It's really fascinating, what information can be gleaned from satellites about planets orbiting other stars that we that we'll never go to in our lifespans. Will be 20 generations from now, and they'll never set foot on any of these planets, but we can still see things about them or detect things about them from the different wavelengths of light that come out from there. And there's a great social and cultural benefit to that. It's not something you can quantify really, but it's one of those things where if it went away, I think people would notice and they'd want it back.
100%. And I think there was, I don't know who said it. It was some, just a point about how if you got rid of satellites and you got rid of space programs, space technology, we would be back to basically a late 1950s level of technology in more ways than one. And a huge...
It would be worse because a lot of the technology we had in the 50s we offloaded to space.
Those for sure. Yes.
We'd have to rebuild it from scratch.
You'd have to rebuild it from scratch for sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
No, there's some people out there who really want to start moving actually even more things into space. So a lot of people talk about like asteroid mining is something. I think that is a huge long shot. I think that it is way more expensive to get to an asteroid and bring whatever you find there back than the worth of what's ever on there.
Yeah, with the minerals on the asteroid.
Yeah, unless like a mile-sized cube of palladium somehow entered low Earth orbit in a stable way. It's just not going to happen. Same thing, like some resources on the moon. Maybe there's something useful, but probably not like economically super useful. There's a lot of science and discovery work to be done there. There's a lot of research that could be done for our benefit. But like if someone says, "Hey, I'm going to the moon to find stuff to get rich," I'm very skeptical. But people want to move certain types of manufacturing of certain precision components into space because you don't have the pull of gravity distorting things at a nanoscopic level, which actually affected Hubble. A lot of people might remember from the early 90s when Hubble was launched and all the pictures were fuzzy. It was because they didn't account for the weight of the mirror under gravity when they carved it out. So there's some things that can be made in space, maybe like some computer components or things like that. It's going to be expensive, high technology stuff, but eventually that's going to make its way down the pipeline into more practical things, just like how computers in the 1940s took up an entire room and only 3 people in the world knew how to use them, to now there's so many computers in my home, I wish I could throw them away. But some of the things that are going to be going to space that are more practical than, like asteroid mining is some people want to start putting servers up in space because power is becoming a premium down here, and solar panels are really good at producing power, and where there's a huge amount of sunlight is in orbit. The new CEO of Relativity, a company that's that was going for 3D printing rockets. Their new CEO used to work at Google. I think he was CEO of Google as well, and he's investing in the company. And he stated publicly it's because a lot of computation might be moving to orbit, just to give way to because it's not in the way of things here. It's not like Microsoft reinstating 3 Mile Island to get another AI farm going. They can use the power of the sun for storing and processing huge amounts of data, and because of the satellites that are now in orbit, send that back down to Earth. So that's one of the things that's really going to be interesting, is moving computation into space. Blue Origin really wants to move industry into space. We'll see how that works. I think that there are certain things that can be done in orbit better than they can be done here, but that's kind of like the future of like some of the practical things that can be done done from orbit, as well. Like people talking about colonizing Mars, I think need to be a little bit realistic about the amount of resources it would take just to get stuff there, and how much stuff we need to develop before people can live safely on Mars for even, more than a few weeks. But there are things that are currently happening and will be happening in space soon that are going to have a real benefit for your everyday person.
Yeah. Well, and I'm just you saying this makes me think about sort of the science fiction concept of like the orbital construction platform, where you basically have a big giant construction site to build things like spacecraft and build sort of these large structures or vehicles or what have you, outside the confines of gravity, so you can then build things on these very grand scale. Obviously, I'm speaking in science fiction terms, not in real life terms as of yet. But
yeah, we're not going to see anything like that anytime soon. I'd love to see, massive floating shipyards and, galaxy class cruisers being built in orbit, going off to the far end of the quadrant.
Got a ways to go.
Yeah,
you have a ways to go.
There's a ways to go. I think that maybe assembling certain types of spacecraft in space in decades and decades from now, using some resources, might be worth looking into at some point. But again, that's a futuristic long shot, shall we say?
Yeah. But to talk a little bit more about that, which is sort of what we're working on, what sort of some interesting updates are in the realm of space beyond just low Earth orbit, as we get to the moon and Mars and the outer planets of the solar system, and then even beyond to other star systems and planets around other star systems. Do you want to talk about sort of the things that are going on in that realm of space technology?
Yes. So there are, contingent on, like we discussed earlier.
Yes. All with
things.
Yes, all with a contingency.
There are some very interesting things in the pipeline. Some of them are already on their way. They've already been launched. But two of the missions I'm very excited about, big flagship NASA ones, are Europa Clipper, which is not going to orbit Europa. It's going to actually orbit Jupiter. Due to the orbital mechanics, it would be very difficult to orbit Europa itself, but it's going to make a large number of very close flybys and get some fantastic information on Europa. The other mission that I am really excited for is called Dragonfly, and I mentioned that earlier, and that's going to the moon of Saturn, Titan, which it's a very small moon, or sorry, it's a very large moon, but it has very low gravity compared to Earth, but it has an incredibly thick atmosphere, which means that you can build a helicopter, because the helicopter weighs very little, but there's lots of atmosphere for the propellers to latch onto, that can do a lot. So they are sending a radiothermal isotope powered helicopter to a moon of Saturn before too long, and that helicopter is going to hop around and take pictures of a body in our solar system that we know very little about. There's only been one mission to the surface of Titan. That was around 2004. It was part of the Cassini mission, and the probe detached from Cassini. It was called Huygens and landed on the surface of Titan. But there's lakes of liquid natural
Methane. It's
gas
methane,
there.
if I
It's
remember.
just yeah, liquid
That's the
methane
big one on Titan. Yeah.
everywhere. It's just it's one of those things where I'm really hoping it's going to be one of those alien worlds that no sci-fi author or movie or concept has ever touched upon. It was the same way that Pluto and some of the objects we've observed past Pluto's orbit have just been nothing was as expected. I'm very excited for those missions. I'm excited for the Artemis program as well, going back to the moon for the first time in a very, very long time. And the impetus to go back seems to really reappear sadly every couple of months we lose another Apollo astronaut. Just 3 or 4 days ago we lost Jim Lovell, the commander of Apollo
Oh yeah, I
13.
did. Yeah, I did see that. Yeah.
Yeah, the only person to fly to the moon twice but never land. He flew on Apollo 8, the first mission to fly around the moon, and then on Apollo 13. One of, I think, the greatest astronauts in world history. He's up there with Michael Collins and John Young as personal favorites who not everyone talks about. Going back to the moon, that's part of NASA's plan. Now, we don't really have an idea of how the lander's going to go just yet. The engineering work is far from done on that, but we have a rocket that can send an Orion capsule around the moon. It did it without any people on board a couple of years ago, and hopefully this year or early next year, it's going to send people to fly around the moon for the first time since the early 1970s again, which is going to be really, really exciting. And I see their provided the political will is there, a long-term presence being set up on the moon, the same way NASA set up a long-term presence in low Earth orbit with the International Space Station. Before that, people went up to orbit and then came back down in pretty short order, with a few exceptions on Mir and Skylab and Soyuz. But the ISS has been occupied since 2000. I
I
want to
was going
say,
to say, I'm trying to remember the
yeah.
timeline. Now, it wasn't fully finished. It was fully finished around, was it like 2008, 10?
Around 2011
11.
was when it
Okay.
was like official,
Yeah.
because that's when the space
So it
shuttle
was
was
done.
retired, but it was essentially in its current form around like 2007, 2008,
Yeah.
close to
Yeah.
being finished. But it has had people on board since 2000
Just,
continuously.
wow.
There hasn't been a day since then that no one has been on board. And every day we're setting a new record for the longest time that people have continuously been in space. So I'd like to see that on the moon. I hope that's what we decide to do with the moon. And then, of course, the next big thing is Mars. Some people see the moon as a distraction for Mars. Some people see Mars as just completely impractical. I'm one of those people who I think that Mars is doable. I think it'll be expensive. I think it's going to take a long time. And it's going to require coordination and cooperation with NASA, commercial partners, international partners as well. And we need to be realistic about what a Mars mission can be and what we can do on Mars. It's not going to be we're building a city on Mars. It's the way that I view the moon and Mars is the same way that I view the South Pole in Antarctica, and that is we're not colonizing Antarctica. It's completely dependent on support from the six other continents. It's completely inhospitable. There are no cities there, no sufficient self-sufficiency whatsoever, but it's a robust, very productive scientific outpost, and we do support it year year round. We have people at the South Pole continuously, and that's what I'd like to see with the Moon and Mars: is continuously occupied scientific outpost stations doing really good research and really good work, doing the sort of things that rovers just can't do. The whole boots on the ground phase or phrase, and focusing on what can we learn from there rather than these distracting conversations about like which billionaire wants to name a city after themselves that they're going to build up there. And if you look at the Starship and New Glenn and the capabilities that they offer, it's not unrealistic to see them being used to lay the groundwork for a presence on these two bodies. And once we've learned how to continuously operate scientific outposts on the moon and then on Mars, which is a huge leap. Just with communication, you can't talk in real time. Who knows what comes next? As for going back to like scientific missions in terms of the other planets and stuff like that, is one thing that's really great about commercial spaceflight is that now you don't need the full force of NASA's resources to send probes and do scientific missions on other bodies. We already see commercial companies sending scientific missions to the moon, and right now they're kind of doing it themselves to demonstrate that they can, and then in the future it's going to be universities and governments hiring them to perform scientific missions on there. There'll probably be some prospectors hiring them to go look for resources, and they'll have what prospectors have happened to them, as we saw in California and Alaska. No one's going to really get rich except for the people selling the pickaxes, but someone might find something. It's worth taking a look. Um, I'd like to see those commercial assets be used to send more decentralized missions to Mars, more cheap, expendable platforms that if something goes wrong, it's no big deal. Four or five others were launched at the same time. I'd really like to see a focus on Venus as well. Venus is not too far away. We can get there. We know very little about it. It's an absolutely hellish landscape, and I use that word in the
In the literal sense of the
literal
word.
sense.
Yes.
Yeah, it's so hot that the mountains are melting under their own weight, and metal doesn't survive there, and the atmosphere made out of acid. But I'd like to see some work put into making probes that can last in the atmosphere and on the surface of Venus for more than just a few minutes, because that's the longest any spacecraft that has re-entered or entered into the atmosphere there has lasted. It's been minutes. It's just, yeah, we don't really, we have like maybe one or two really low quality pictures that were taken by probes sent by the Soviet Union in the
I
70s.
was going to say, I
Russia.
thought it was a Soviet probe in,
Yep.
in like, it's been a few decades, yeah, that we've
Yeah,
done this
it's
with
been a very
Venus,
long
yeah.
time, and Russia has talked about going back there, but the general rule is anything that Russia has said about their notions in space over the past 10 years means that it's never going to
It's
happen.
never going to, yeah.
It's their space program's broke. It comes with all the baggage that comes with any major operation conducted by the Russian government.
Yeah,
Not
no,
to
it's
get
it's it's a
political,
bit of a
but
hot,
it's
yeah, it's a bit of a hot mess.
it's yeah, not to get political, but it's true. It's
Yeah.
real. The but yeah, like, maybe send some stuff to Mercury. Mercury's one of those planets that doesn't get a lot of attention because it's relatively inert, or so we thought. The more we observe it, the more interesting things we find.
Oh,
The same with any
okay.
planet.
I didn't know that. Yeah, I was just under the impression is sort of you put it in the same category as it's a bigger version of the moon. It's a rock, and it's just kind
Yeah,
of there.
it's but then there's Jupiter's got all these moons.
Yes. Yeah, all the Europa stuff
Saturn.
too. All
Yeah, and
the
then
potential liquid ocean with Europa and yeah.
yeah, and then there's never been an orbiter for any of the bodies beyond Saturn. So Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, all of those. No, they've had flybys, which means that every picture you've ever seen of those planets was taken over the course of a couple of minutes as a spacecraft zipped past it, never to return. And I'd like to see some of the resources that we have and the lower cost of spaceflight and some of the new technologies to get probes to these planets faster, because it's going to take 12 years to get to them or something crazy like that, just in transit time to get there. Nuclear thermal propulsion is something that's kind of interesting that could speed that up as well. But yeah, they're sitting out there and we haven't really studied them in that much depth, and there's only so much you can find out just from telescopes here on Earth. Now, the amount that we have found out has been absolutely massive. I am consistently thrilled and impressed with the amount of information about bodies in our solar system and beyond that we can get from Earth, but you can always get more from on location.
Yes. What are and I'm just curious. What are some of those like interesting facts that we've figured out about like some of the outer planets, as you mentioned, just from like more recent work with telescopes.
So, some of them are, I mean, like, it feels like every couple of months a new moon of Saturn is discovered.
Oh wow.
Now,
Okay.
they're usually very small moons, but They're not nothing. I mean, just all the stuff we found out about the composition and the shape and the geography of Pluto. So,
Yes.
what New Horizons discovered on Arrokoth after it flew past Pluto, where it was two moons lumped together, or two planets,
And
subplanet, dwarf planets.
what is Arrokoth?
Arrokoth is a trans-Neptunian object, so it is something that orbits way, way out there, way beyond Pluto, and sometimes crosses past the orbit of Neptune. And it's two, it looks like two asteroids that are stuck together with a, like a snowman with no legs, where it's got a head and a torso. And I remember the reaction image of the scientists seeing the first image come in became a reaction meme because of the complete like shock and delight on their faces. And it was just one of those things where reality was so much weirder than we thought it was going to be. Other things that we, discover aside from just Arrokoth, it's just, I mean, we've discovered other, subplanet type bodies in the solar system from telescopes here on Earth. We've discovered from space telescopes planets around other stars.
Yes. And at this point, it's a lot. There
It's
are a
oh yeah,
ton
it's
of planets,
yeah,
exoplanets
huge,
around
yeah,
other
huge. I mean, it's
stars
getting
now.
to the point where we can take photographs of them.
Yeah.
As well. I mean, sometimes it's just 1 or 2 pixels of these planets, and they usually have to be a huge planet very close to a star, pretty close by, but we're getting better and better at it. And Kepler is a space telescope up in space in orbit, launched on a rocket that has been the one of the greatest tools. Actually, no, it is the greatest tool in finding these exoplanets around other stars. And some of the things that we've observed or that we can detect. We can't really see it, but we know it's happening based off of the various measurements we can take. That like some of them have like oceans of molten metal and just absolutely crazy things like that. That sounds like something that came off of like an '80s speed metal album cover almost, or like a Frank Frazetta drawing, deep fried 50 times. Uh, but I mean, there are even some ideas that are not like completely physically impossible about sending something out there to Alpha Centauri that can maybe get there in like 100 years or
Is this
something
the
like
light
that.
sail idea that had been
It's
kicked
not.
around, or is this a different one?
It's one of the where it has a sail, but we use lasers to boost it. And you just continuously like fire a laser at it to speed it up, so that it essentially keeps accelerating.
And you can send like a tiny little camera that weighs
Yeah,
like a fraction of an
something
ounce.
puny,
Or,
and
yeah.
even then, the pictures that it would take years to get back anyway. One of those things where, like, if someone can do it for cheap, it's kind of like like, well, why not?
Yeah, it was like, wasn't it like Zuckerberg and some like Russian billionaire were kicking around the idea? I'm trying to remember.
Oh,
It was a few years ago, but it was this idea of like,
yeah,
we're going to shoot it out there and it'll get there in like 50 years or something, and
maybe, yeah. I mean,
maybe if we're lucky.
there's always some idea like that about like what's happening, what's possible. Um, yeah, and a lot of times these are ideas that people just like are discussing as a theoretical, and then they get picked up by the news websites and get represented as something significantly more than they are. It was kind of like how I mentioned earlier with people talking about the astronauts being stranded. Um, Unfortunately, there's just so many news articles out there, many of them from sources that a lot of people consider reputable, that just don't understand this industry and don't understand how things work in space. And a lot of it just says, oh, well, why don't we do this and why don't we do that? And a lot of people think that certain things in space are easy, not realizing that just basic orbital mechanics precludes that from happening. Getting information on what's going on in the space industry can be a little bit difficult, and listening to some of the opinions out there from people who are not experts. Um, a lot of them come from, you'll see a lot of them on like social media posts. People just they heard something about something from someone else, and for the listeners and viewers, there are actually a couple of resources that I'd highly recommend for them if you'd like me to share.
Yeah, please do. Please do. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not paid by any of these people. These are just things that I use, for my own personal education, sometimes for news on the industry. But there's a website I really like called Spaceflight Now that does really good coverage of the happenings of all the different space programs, and they do their own live streams of all the SpaceX Starship, the super heavy, the super rocket that they've been launching that keeps blowing up. They do their own streams of those, and they're really informative, and they're very good conversationalists as well. They're up on YouTube, so I usually actually watch them sometimes over the official launch because ever since Elon bought Twitter, SpaceX doesn't stream on YouTube anymore, so that's been kind of frustrating. But Spaceflight Now, or sorry, NASAspaceflight.com is a great resource. Spaceflight Now is also a really good one if you want really clinical information, something there's no color or personality to it. It's just straight facts, and they are the where I go to figure out when launches are taking place. They always have a list of all the scheduled launches and when they're scheduled to go up or when they're estimated to go up, and they're really really good at keeping track of all of that with whatever information is available out there. So I really enjoyed them as a resource as well for like scientific and spacecraft concepts. If you're an everyday person, it is hard to go wrong with someone like Scott Manley and his YouTube channel. He does an absolutely fantastic job at talking about different concepts in the spaceflight industry, news, he's covered almost everything at this point, and he is one of those people who, even if you're technical, it's really interesting to watch and listen to. But if you don't know the first thing about about rockets or how they work and stuff like that, he has an explanation for that out there. Uh, and for people who want something a little bit more interactive, there's a game out there called Universe Sandbox and Universe Sandbox 2, and it's really fun to play around. You can see how the planets move. But when it comes to something that's really interactive and hands-on for learning how rockets work, it's really you can't do better than the original Kerbal Space Program.
I've
Don't get
heard of the
kids.
Kerbal Space
Yeah,
Program. I've never played it, but I've heard of this game. Yeah.
it is absolutely fantastic. There are people who work at NASA who have PhDs in orbital dynamics who say that they never really could visualize how they knew how the math worked, but could never really get their head around it until they played this game. And what it is it's essentially Minecraft for rockets or Lego for rockets. You're given a bunch of rocket parts and you clip them together, and then you can go fly them with your little green alien characters. And it's for Windows, and I think it was maybe ported to Xbox or Mac or Linux. But it is a fantastic program for getting into it and learning how things work, and it is so much fun. Even though I do this as my profession, I fire this up every now and again just to do neat things. You could do everything like just do a little suborbital model rocket flight to landing probes on their outer planets in their little fictional solar system, building space station, docking, rendezvous, science missions, and they've got like missions you can do, or you can just play sandbox for fun and do whatever you like. It's educational, it's fun, it's addictive too, better or
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah.
And then, but then for just like some reading, some of the articles on these missions, um, on Wikipedia are fantastic. It's not the best for speculative of what's coming up because there's just so much information and so many what ifs. But if you just want to get an idea for what happened on like each Apollo mission, read the page on Apollo 12, Apollo 10, some of the lesser known missions. Read the one on Apollo 11 if you want to go with the big one. And then there was a podcast I listened to that was really educational, really interesting, and captivating called 13 Minutes to the Moon, made by the BBC. And it's about the final 13 minutes of the descent of Apollo 11 when a bunch of things started going wrong all at once. But it covers a lead up to it, starting from the conceptualization of Apollo, the people who worked on it, how and it was mostly focused on the computer. And I'm more of a rocket engine sort of guy. I don't do as much of the software and the avionics, and I learned so much from it as a technical person. But there are people out there who couldn't tell you the difference between a Saturn V and an Inmarsat who got just as much out of it as I did. And they have a sequel series called I think it's 13 Sunsets or something like that about the space shuttle that I just started somewhat recently. And that's a really good resource as well.
Now, before we wrap up, I just wanted to check if there's any last sort of point, concept, important PSA, et cetera, that you'd sort of like to make on the substantive things before we move into final closing statements about where can we find you, what you're working on, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so when it comes to things in the industry, SpaceX is not the only player out there. There are a lot more companies out there. Rocket Lab has a very exciting rocket coming up called Neutron, which is the large part of the atom, one of the heavy heavy particles as opposed to their Electron, their small rocket. And that one's going to be going after SpaceX and what they've been doing, their bread and butter for the past 10 years or so. And that is a rocket that has a very unique appearance and architecture because it opens up like the rocket in the James Bond movie You Only Live Twice, where it opens up like this crocodile, and the second stage comes out, and then it closes again, and then it comes back down to land vertically. And that's a very interesting company for the listeners and viewers to look up. It got started in New Zealand, and that company has never had a billionaire benefactor just throwing money at it. There's Relativity is going to be fielding a new rocket soon. And that's going to be really interesting. There are a bunch of space companies in Europe that over the past 2 months have attempted launches. The first launch from mainland Europe was launched out of Norway or Sweden recently, and the thing didn't. It got about a minute in the flight before it came back down and hit the frozen Arctic water and created a fireball in the ice. Very spectacular video. Australia just had their first launch of one of their own rockets for the first time. That lasted about 7 seconds, but that's progress. A lot of rockets just blow up on the launch pad. There's in terms of NASA's going to be they're working on the new mission to the moon, Artemis 2. That's going to be very fascinating to watch, and that'll be coming up hopefully in the next year or so. China's really trying to catch up. I have some major qualms with how they do a lot of things in terms of their operations, their designs, their considerations for safety, but they have a space station that very few people know about.
This is the Tiangong, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah,
it is,
that's
yeah.
Heavenly Palace is the name.
Yeah.
Hold on, let me double check.
We'll just double check that. But I'm just going off of what I remember from Gravity, and then I looked at maybe one subsequent.
Tiangong is the name of it.
Yeah.
It's actually they've had space station-like modules before, but this is their first like modular space station as we know them. And so if people have further questions about how rockets work, because we talked mostly about an industry thing, but what I really love talking about is how rockets work, the mechanisms, the designs, the engines, the engine cycles, and all that stuff. So I have an account on Twitter. Alexander Taleb is my handle. You'll see my lovely picture there, and feel free to discuss the industry and things like that there with me.
Cool. Well, Alexander Taleb, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
And it's been delightful to be here, Chris. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And everyone, if you made it to the end, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us out. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time.